and then I'll introduce myself and my people.
Okay.
And
All right, we're good.
to Eric and
You want to start that night? We're good.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Adam Burney. I'm the land use director here in the town of Lunenburg. I see a lot of familiar faces and maybe one or two faces I don't recognize. We're here for the master plan kickoff forum, public meeting. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have our consultants from Over Under, RKG, and Inez Associates go through a couple of exercises, talk about some of the data they've collected, and elicit some hopeful responses from you folks. So right now I'd like to introduce Rami El-Samani from Over Under, and he'll introduce his team.
Good evening again. Thank you for coming. We recognize that you have other things to do in your lives, so we're grateful that you came today. I'm just going to get this running. Of course, it was working. Do I need to wait for the projection? While that warms up, let me just give a brief introduction. My name is Rami El-Samahi. I am a principal at Over Under. Over Under is we call ourselves a multidisciplinary design firm, which means we do, we like to say everything from the city to the book. We do urban planning, we do urban design, we do architecture, graphic design, and interiors. So because of that, we sort of are able to look at things from multiple points of view, and we hope to you the service of giving you our full attention from these multiple points of view. I'm here, I'll just quickly introduce my associates. Brett Pearson, Rue Kondrop, and Fotini Bulleri. They are all part of our team on this and have sort of done different pieces. I'll introduce Eric, who will also introduce his team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Halverson. I'm a principal with RKG Associates. We are mostly probably well known as an economic development and market analytics firm, but we do all sorts of municipal planning, from comprehensive plans to downtown plans, corridor plans, you name it. We do a lot of work in the housing sphere as well. We're joining Over Under's team for this master plan to work on housing, economic development, transportation, and the public facilities and services components of the plan. So we'll be talking about those tonight. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Chris Herlick, who you'll hear from in a bit, and Julianne Ding, who have been working with me on the project so far. And Emily, you want to come up?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Ennis, and I am the president of Ennis Associates, also an urban planner and urban designer. Do comprehensive and strategic plans, corridor plans, all different scales, but my primary role for this effort and in working with you is going to be looking at the implications of zoning. So understanding what you have to say, what the community has to say, and how does that translate into thinking about what the zoning can help to accomplish. So you'll be seeing me a lot, especially towards that part of the process.
We're delighted, I should say, to be working in Lunenburg and also to be working with RKG and Emily. This is, I think, a very great team because there's a lot of overlapping approaches, but quite a wide variety of skill sets, and I think that hopefully will strengthen what we do. Just very briefly, what we're looking at tonight, our agenda is these brief introductions. We'll then sort of go through what we call existing conditions, which means the state of the town at the moment. followed by our first breakout, which is code for you get to talk. And then we'll come back, sort of address visions and goals for a sort of introduction to sort of get you to be thinking about the next breakout, which is the sort of breakout number 2. And I'll explain each of these breakouts a little bit later when we get to them, and then we'll sort of kind of regroup and talk sort of next steps and where we go from here. Next, please. This was us. Thank you. Next, please. What we're doing here, we're working on the comprehensive plan, the master plan for the town of Lunenburg. You may know what that means, so please forgive me if I'm repeating something that you're well familiar with. But every decade or so, the state asks towns and cities, all municipalities across the Commonwealth to reassess where they are, and through these very specific lenses that we'll get to in a moment. But really, to do that, we have to start by kind of together, collectively assessing where you are and where it is you want to go, and what the sort of shared community vision is to get there. So there's loosely 3 phases. This is a 2-year process, so you'll be seeing and hearing from us a lot, and hopefully you won't get tired of us by the end of it, but you'll get to know us well, and hopefully we will get to know you equally well. The first phase is what we sort of call the discovery phase. We're here to learn as much as we can, to understand the city, the town, to look through all sorts of, whether it's photographic assessments, looking through GIS information, town records, the plans and studies that have come before us, and most importantly, sort of hearing from the community. This is one way to hear from the community, what we're doing today. The survey that I alluded to earlier is another way to hear from the community. And hopefully, throughout this process, we're going to figure out other ways to hear from the community as well. So we began about a month ago in earnest. That will take us sort of into the fall. By that point, we'll begin phase 2, which is sort of what we call testing and recommending. That is sort of looking through these 8 different lenses, and based on the kind of the shared vision and goals that we have collectively assembled, we'll start to say, well, what if ... and start to fill in some of those ... and hear back from you. And this is what we call an iterative process. So we sort of spit something out, we get some feedback. I love it, I hate it, how do this, try this. And we sort of, that feedback loop allows us to iterate and refine the recommendations until the recommendations ultimately reflect what the community wants for its future. And then once we've sort of coalesced around those ideas, we get to the final phase where you'll hear a little less from us because we'll be busy putting together all those ideas and then we'll present them to you in draft form and then in final form. Next, please. Oh, one more thing, sorry. Throughout the whole process, we're quite keen on, and the RFP was written to be sort of to heavily engage with the public and the community effort, and that's something that drew us to the RFP and Lunenburg, because that commitment is something we're quite excited about. Next, please. Early days. So, all right. Existing conditions. We're going to go through these together. So we'll kind of lay them out. the way the state of Massachusetts wants us to address these things. That does not necessarily mean that there aren't overlaps and there aren't connections between one chapter and the other. But let's start here and then find those overlaps. Next, please. Well, we'll sort of start with something that's a little bit outside of that. One is just sort of what's the sort of town look like? What's changed in the last, let's say, 10 to 20 years? I think one of the key things that's changed, and it's probably not news to any of you, you're one of the fastest growing towns in the Commonwealth. It's growing you're growing much faster than you had anticipated. Part of that is probably to do with the pandemic. Part of it is just the changing nature of work in general. You're also trending sort of towards an aging population, which is to say you're certainly sort of above the average in terms of the spread of your age groups across the spread compared to other places in the state and the nation. And you have sort of a quite healthy median income. It may not feel like that to everyone individually, but as an aggregate and on average, you're sort of above the state median, and both in terms of income levels and education levels. So what do these, when we sort of look at these things, we then try to think, well, what are the implications with respect to the master plan, and with respect to thinking about the next 10 to 20 years in Lunenburg and how you want to plan for them. So these are sort of some of the questions that we've come up with. How do we address future housing needs given the sort of rise in population? How do we respond to the needs, the growing needs of senior citizens and people who may soon be senior citizens? And then finally, how can we leverage your relatively comfortable and relatively well-educated population to point the town in the directions that it wants to be going in the next 10 to 20 years. Next, please. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. This will be available publicly if you want to look at it, but we're sort of looking at 2010 here to 2020. Next, please. It's quite a jump. Over 15% population growth. Next, please. In terms of your age, and obviously, this is technically your senior citizens, right? But this demographic's not far off either. So just something to consider when you add those two together and thinking about the future. Next, please. And then we sort of alluded to both income and education. You are in a relatively comfortable position on both counts. Next, please. I should say, just one of the things as a population sort of becomes wealthier, that also has an impact on those who've lived here for longer. For example, tax rates go up. It becomes harder to stay in your home as a result. So we have to think about everyone. When we say it's a relatively comfortable scenario, that we must recognize that that doesn't necessarily address everybody. I'm going to give Eric the mic here.
Thanks, Rami. I always think about existing conditions as sort of drinking from a fire hose. Often when we enter a community, it's both that way for us, but it also can be that way for the community members too. We're in information gathering mode, digesting everything, and then often trying to regurgitate that back in a manner that's understandable to you all as residents. One reason we set the slides up this way was to just share with you, so it's not like drinking from a fire hose for you, but it's more just, these are the quick things that we've learned in the time that we've been in Lunenburg. So you'll see that on the left. And then we sort of have questions posed on the right, which I think we'll talk about in the breakout groups, just to get you thinking about the relationship between the data that we're collecting and understanding and then how it applies to the master plan. Not just say for public facilities, but what is the impact across public facilities, but also how do demographics impact public facilities, how do transportation and investments and finance impact public facilities, and so on. So you'll see that throughout the slides. It's kind of the way that we set it up. I spent a full day, and I mean a full day last week, interviewing all the department heads and some elected officials about public facilities. So I got a really good idea of what's going on. I understand there's actually quite a bit of discussion going on right now in town, which I think is good that you're talking about it. Some of Lunenburg's public buildings are old. I know you did back in about 2005, 2006, a pretty big overhaul of a couple of the buildings, but there's some to go, particularly potentially this one that we're in today, depending on what the plan is in the future. But just recognizing that some are old, they require continued maintenance, they require continued upkeep, and maybe at some point, a different building is constructed. But there's also different ways to address those facilities, each requiring a different level of financial investment. So if you have a facility that just maybe needs a new HVAC system and that can extend the life of that building for another 10 years, that's one size of investment. If the building is completely antiquated and it's not really worth, sort of putting money into it to keep it around, building a new building might be an option, which obviously comes with a very different price tag. And we recognize that those discussions are ongoing today. So we hope to integrate those into the master plan as we go forward. And then we know that the town really went through, as Rami said, a pretty significant period of growth over the last couple decades. I think it was something like 50% at some point if you go back far enough, a couple decades. And what I learned in the interviews was that although new facilities have been built and there are older facilities, there's been the need to add more equipment and more staffing over time, which then sort of pushes up against the space that we have today. So I think there's also discussions about, is some of the space that we have adequate for the growth that we had? Or maybe as we think 10 years or 15 years into the future, if the town does want to grow or maybe even maintain what we have today, how do public facilities need to change over that period of time? Next, please. And just a couple of really quick statistics in case you aren't familiar, but Lunenburg does maintain about 300,000 square feet of public buildings across schools, town facilities, recreational facilities like the beach house at the town beach. And you can see from the chart that I put together, I always include the year that it was built, but then more importantly, the year that it was last renovated. So you can just see that there have been, in some cases, a lot of major renovations that have happened, particularly to sort of the bottom half here. But there are some facilities that haven't necessarily gone through a major renovation in recent years either. And I think some of those are the ones that are sort of being talked about today about what happens with those. One of the great things that I learned in the interviews and looking through documents is that it seems like the town has a really great sort of fiscal policy and fiscal management policy, but also seems like you have a really good sort of capital improvements program and capital improvements plan, where department heads are submitting requests. Those are going through a really sort of rigorous vetting by the committee, coming back out with an explanation of why things are getting funded, why they aren't. That's not the case in all communities that we work in, so I think that's really great. And I'll just stop there. Next slide, and turn it over back to Rami.
So the next section of the master plan is land use, which is sort of hopefully self-explanatory, looking at the way the town's land is being used. You can see actually behind Eric, for example, there's a sort of, that's what we call a land use map there, and that has listed all the different areas and the different zoning districts within the town. What we're wanting to do first and foremost is sort of understand how things have changed. And I think it's not news to you that one of the sort of big changes in Lunenburg is the sort of evolution from kind of transformation from a largely agrarian-based economy to one that is more of what we might call a bedroom community. We've got to find a better word for it than that, but I think we know what we mean here. At the same time, people are coming because they're attracted to the rural quality that you have. So how do you keep the agriculture, the recreation, and the conservation land part of moving forward. At the same time, you have some significant, for a town this size, some significant area for industrial land use. We were surprised when we saw it first, and then you look at the maps and you can see what that means. Your commercial areas are slightly different, and we can maybe that's something we talk about in the breakout spaces. In terms of residential uses, you're predominantly single-family residential uses, but there are sort of several townhouse and multifamily on the edges, particularly towards Fitchburg, and we understand there's at least one more to come that is of some discussion and debate, which we can address as well. Next, please. So this is the land use map that I alluded to. You can see, for example, this is that industrial zone, the commercial in and around here, but also along 13 and 2A, and then that sort of light beige is your residential single-family area, and the green is sort of either agricultural or conservation land. Next, please. So in terms of zoning, it's slightly different than the use map, but it does kind of clearly outline what is possible in terms of growth today. If at during this process we determine that this may not be where the town is headed, right, or we need to alter this, then this is the right process for doing that. But currently you have very clearly, two different kinds of residential, a very clear commercial corridor along out of town center into 2A, this part of 13, and then the industrial office park and industrial zone in the south. Next, please.
So we heard a little bit already about the demographics in town in recent history, and that obviously has a tremendous influence on housing, and likewise housing can influence demographics. I think we have noted that in recent decades, and especially in the past decade, that housing stock in town has definitely gotten more diverse. You've been able to add more buildings with a larger number of units, structures with 10 plus units, for example. And also, unsurprisingly, as we see the population increase, the number of households increase, and that means the demand for housing increases as well. Part of the recent trend is also, we'll see in just a moment in greater detail, that renter households have increased as a proportion of overall households in town. And a final thing to note here is that the housing market regionally, as I'm sure you're all aware, locally and regionally, the housing market is very competitive. Houses don't stay on the market for very long. They often sell at or above asking, sometimes with significant increases year over year in both home values and sale prices and in rents as well. So as Eric mentioned, we have some questions associated with each of these findings. We do want to think about the existing housing stock, of course, but we want to think about what other additions to the housing stock might be feasible, desirable, or needed. And as we think about the way households are changing and the increase in households, what kinds of households are they? Are they families? Are they individuals? What kinds of services might they need associated with their housing or separately? And what kinds of people are moving in, and what might they be bringing to the community? What might they be needing from us as their neighbors? And I think we're all starting to understand that a region with a lot of housing demand that outstrips housing supply could use more housing supply. Let's start to think about maybe where redevelopment might be feasible to allow some of this housing. It's not going to be everywhere. Not everywhere will make sense for more housing, but there might be opportunities to further diversify the housing stock, to help add more neighbors, as we mentioned before. Some of those might be affordable units, some of those might be market rate. What the mix of those might be is also an important discussion that we plan on having. Head to the next slide. We'll look a little bit closer at some of those data points that I mentioned. The graph on the left shows the range of housing types, essentially. So each of those little bars, vertical bars, indicates the proportion of a specific type of housing, whether it's a single family unit, whether it's two units in a single building, 3 to 4 units in a single building, 5 to 9, so on and so forth. As you can see, the proportion of single family has shrunk over the past decade. That doesn't mean the number of single family homes has shrunk in the past decade, and in fact, that is not the case. The number of single family homes has increased, but just not at the rate that these other types of housing have increased. And in fact, the total number of housing units, households in Lunenburg has increased from just over 3,700 to more than 4,400 in that time period, which is a pretty notable jump. We talked before about the ownership versus renter households. Right now, 81% of the households in town are owner-occupied, which is about 10 percentage points higher than in the north central Massachusetts region overall. And one thing we also wanted to note, as we were talking before about the composition of households, the number and proportion of people living alone in their homes has significantly increased over the past decade. So that does suggest that the type of housing that might be needed, the type of services that might be needed, could be changing. And of course, I mentioned before the competitiveness of the housing market. This is just one indication. These are the median sales price for homes in Lunenburg. Of course, they fluctuate seasonally, but from 2012, 2013, there's a jump from about 200,000 to where we are now, where we're occasionally up over 525,000, which is huge. And as Rami previously mentioned, as housing prices and housing values increase, tax bills often increase as well. So that's something we need to be aware of. Economic development is a topic that encapsulates a lot of things. When we talk about economic development at RKG, we don't just see it as real estate development. We don't just see it as jobs. It's really something more holistic. It's more about quality of life for residents and visitors, but specifically for residents. And so that can touch on a lot of topics, like I mentioned, jobs, real estate development, housing, many other things. But we have focused so far most of our analysis on jobs and commuting patterns, so that's what we'll share with you for the time being. So regionally, it's a strong economy. The number of jobs is growing over the past decade. Healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, construction, and arts and entertainment are the fastest growing regional industries, and that can help us think about what kinds of space we might want to see in Lunenburg, want to see more of. Do we want to appeal to these specific industries? Are there others that might be growing not quite as quickly that we think could find a place here? We also noted that there are many more people on a daily basis that leave Lunenburg to head to work than come to the town. And that's not surprising, as Rami mentioned. If you want to call Lunenburg a bedroom community, you don't have to, but in a given day, more people are leaving than are coming in. So it's not exactly a jobs hub. Is that a good thing? Do we want more people to be able to work in town? Do we want more people to be able to live and work in town? These are questions that we pose to you. We want more discussion on those topics, certainly. And in the meantime, when we look at what is happening in Lunenburg right now in the past decade or so, we notice that employment has been concentrating in certain sectors, that the biggest industries, and we'll see those on the next page, the biggest industries are tending to get larger and the smaller industries are tending to get smaller. That could be good, that could be bad. You do maybe want to have a diverse set of employment opportunities in town, a diverse set of industries that can help keep things a little bit more consistent over time in terms of tax revenue, in terms of economic activity in town. But there might be certain industries that you want to target as well. So speaking of drinking from a fire hose, give me just a moment to explain this chart. So this is a graph of the change in jobs in the last decade from 2012 to 2022. That's the y-axis. And the location quotient is on the x-axis. And think about the location quotient as the prevalence of a kind of industry in Lunenburg compared to how common it is in the region. And the region we're talking about here is north central Massachusetts. So something is far off to the right. There's an unusually large number of those jobs in Lunenburg compared to your surrounding communities. If it's really high up on the chart, that means it's grown a lot in the past decade. It's far down, hasn't grown so much, maybe it's shrunk. And so these boulder lines are the division basically between shrinking, growing, and to the right of one means more prevalent compared to the region, to the left of one means less prevalent compared to the region. So you can see your largest industries here are pretty much all growing except for government, which is fairly stable. But there are also some opportunities for small industries that may be an opportunity that you want to foster, that you want to support more. Specifically those in the weak but emerging category, but even those maybe some in the established but strengthening, but with some of the smaller dots as well. So this gives you a general sense of the current employment and industry landscape in the town. We like to look at this because we think it tells a story over time. It tells a story over industries. It can really help us understand what change is occurring in the town, and can help, once we start understanding these different data points, help us understand which industries maybe we value, or which industries we haven't valued enough and want to value more over time.
Okay. I like to think about transportation as probably, I always think, the one of the 8 chapters that literally touches everybody, whether you're working or you're not working, whether you have a home or you're unhoused. At some point, you have to use transportation to get where you're going, whether you're walking, biking, taking the bus, or driving in a car. So I always think of this as like the biggest connector between all the chapters because it literally connects people wherever they're going. But in Lunenburg, most people do drive to get from place to place. There aren't a ton of sidewalks. There are 2 bus routes that sort of traverse the corners of the community, but they're really kind of coming through the community, I think, to get to either Leominster or out to Fitchburg, where I think more people are sort of traveling through Lunenburg than to it. There's not really much in the way of like bike facilities. So in terms of how people could get around within the town and then outside of the town, options are fairly limited, which is, I think, why we see so many people that are driving today. And I guess a big question is that the way we think people want to get around today? And as we think about the future, is that the way we think people want to get around? As I mentioned, there's very few sidewalks, very few transit options. So should we start to prioritize other options, or do we think people are going to continue to drive? And then as the town has sort of grown and expanded, people have become kind of disconnected to some parts of town. So growth has kind of taken place in certain parts of town that are a little bit further from what I call like the core, the nucleus where we are today, where there's businesses here. There's also a lot of civic activity here that people want to get to or might need to get to. But as we grow on the exterior of the community, how can we connect people back to the core? Next slide. So as I mentioned, about 80% of commuters are driving alone to get to work each day. But that's actually down from about 83%. But what's interesting is that change is really resulted from more people working from home rather than people changing the way that they actually get around. I think in Lunenburg, about 7.8% of commuters worked from home about 10 years ago, and now that's about 10.3, so it's up about 3%. I'm sure much of that has to do with the pandemic and the changes to working. And we also looked at just how many sort of miles of sidewalk Lunenburg has on its roadways. There's about 124 miles of roadway in Lunenburg overall, and about 5.5 miles, or about 4%, actually have sidewalks, and much of them are clustered here in the town center, which makes a lot of sense. It's a historical center. It's pretty walkable. But as we think about how people might want to get around in the future, is that something that we might want to prioritize or invest in as we think about Lunenburg 10 or 15 years? The other thing that I thought was interesting is that the town has very few bike facilities, and also most of the sort of trails in which you could bike on are kind of limited to parks and conservation land on the exteriors of the community, as you saw on the land use map. So are there ways in which we could potentially connect like parks and conservation land from a walking and biking and like public health perspective? Or are there ways that we can get people from on-street bike facilities to those trails and try to make connections that way? So maybe something we want to think about as we go forward. And I'm going to skip the last slide just because the colors didn't come through, but we did a regional economic development plan for the whole North Central Mass region 2 years ago. And the most fascinating thing for me was that the commute sheds, so where people live and where they work in North Central Mass, are like hyper local. People are really just traveling to their neighboring communities for work. So the folks who live in Lunenburg are really kind of traveling to Fitchburg and Leominster and maybe over to Gardner. But people in Gardner, their top destination for work is generally Gardner. Leominster, it's generally Leominster. So it's really local, whereas, if you just cross 495, pretty much everybody's going to Boston, or that's usually the top destination. So I thought from a transportation perspective, this was interesting as we think about working, living, and transportation together. Like, where do people actually need to get to if it's not in Lunenburg, but it's over to Fitchburg, and can people actually get there without having to drive?
The next chapter is what's called cultural and historic resources. So these are the sort of the buildings and spaces that are of historic value or cultural value to the town. You have a remarkable downtown. It's really it's beautiful, and almost every building in it is of some historic value. You've recognized that and have designated this area for sort of extra protection and sort of greater scrutiny for new buildings and whatnot. You've established the architectural preservation district zoning, which 2 years ago, is it? 8 years ago, okay. But, and that was sort of one way in which you are sort of ensuring that this sort of historic fabric remains intact. And I think that's fantastic. How will you absorb new construction within this area? What are the mechanisms? Do you like the mechanisms that you have in place? Is there tweaking that is going to be needed today or in the future as you move forward? So, what are the new buildings? What do they look like? How do we make sure that they fit within this historic context? I think is a clear a question for you all. And I think the other big question is, and this is no surprise, I don't think, to anybody in the room, is we don't build the same way we built in the 17th and 18th century. We can, on occasion, there are the skilled craftsmen to do so. In fact, you have a blacksmith right in town who does some amazing wrought ironwork. But those are few and far between, and you need the carpenters and everyone else. So given the culture of construction today versus the buildings you have, how do you see new construction? What is going to be your relation with new construction in these historic zones? Next, please. Again, you can see that there's sort of three locations: the buildings that we're referring to in and around the downtown area, and then the buildings and the sites on these two historic farms, both the Stillman Dairy Farm and the Cherry Hill Farm site. Next, please. Yeah, 2017. So we've talked about this a little bit, how and what you're controlling as you move forward, the degree to which it is working or not working is a question that we would like to hear back from the community. Does it need to be tweaked? Are we generally happy with it? How do we want to think about things moving forward? Next, please. So you've got the historical and cultural resources. You've also got these sort of open space resources. And for a municipality like Lunenburg, these are amazing. You've got both the town forest, but also sort of the parks and recreational areas, as well as sort of conservation lands. And obviously the bodies of water in and around the town. So, Eric referred to it a little bit, but what is the connectivity between these things? How do we increase the connectivity so you can easily hike if hiking is your thing, or biking from one to the other, or if you're not a human but a lot of the flora and fauna that we rely on to breathe and sort of live in this world, the connectivity between these areas is actually a positive, right? For all sorts of animals, the increased area that they can travel is good for biodiversity, which is good for us as well. So thinking about that connectivity on many levels is important. How do we improve public access to these areas? How can we use the municipal lands that the town owns to make greater use of them, both from a recreational point of view, but also from a sort of breathable and sort of just general environmental positivity as well. Next, please. So you can see here that the town actually owns a fair amount of open space in the municipality. Next, please. Some of these are forests, some are sort of conservation areas, some are parks. You have completed, this is what was 2 or 3 years ago, relatively recently, an open space and recreation plan. We are going to be drawing on that a lot for this plan because it was so recent. You came up at that time with these 4 goals: to enhance the existing spaces, to preserve those that are most critical natural resources, to expand wherever possible access to them, and to diversify the funding sources. Next, please. Okay. We have gone through as fast as we can without exhausting you the existing conditions at a high level. What we're going to ask from you, and I think given the size, we can do this in one group. I think that makes most sense rather than break out into several groups. First of all, do you have any questions about what we just went through? Secondly, what stood out to you? Thirdly, what did we miss? Did we get it right? Are there things that we have not spoken about that we ought to be looking at? And then, of the topics that were presented, what resonate? What are most important to you and the people you know? So those are fairly broad questions. We have about 20 minutes for this, so we'll be taking notes and at the end sort of typing that. I think we'll just type it right in now since we're only one breakout group. But if I could ask you, maybe you 3 to turn around so we can sort of speak in a circle, if that makes any sense.
don't know if you've experienced it here, but anytime we have a large gathering in town, there's always a parking problem. So I don't know where that showed up or might have shown up in your research, but I think that's an ongoing issue, especially if we're going to talk about building in the future, or even now, it's a problem. So I don't know where that would fall, but I think that we can all agree that that's something we should be concerned about, or are concerned about right now.
Can I ask you a follow-up to that?
Sure. Debbie?
Great.
Sure.
So when you talk about parking around public buildings, is that primarily in the town center where most of the public buildings are?
Yes, but even, for example, the town beach is an issue. Some of the trails that we're talking about don't have a lot of parking. I think a lot of our public spaces don't have good parking.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Should I keep going?
You're on a roll.
Okay, so I'm the chairman of our Council on Aging, so a lot of my focus is with our aging population, and I was glad to hear that you talked a little bit about that. One of my concerns is, for example, I don't know if you know, but Leominster Hospital, which is one of our closest hospitals, this doesn't relate to aging, obviously, but they're getting rid of their maternity. That doesn't concern older folks, but that may be a harbinger of some of the services that are going to go away and get further and further away. I'm concerned about local health services, and particularly the need for our older citizens to be able to go to health appointments, doctor's appointments, things like that. We don't have public transportation in this town other than a MART service, which is a service that's available to seniors, but we don't have buses in this town. We had 100 years ago, we had a trolley that went up and down Main Street. We've gone backwards in that regard. We have, Fitchburg has buses, Leominster has buses, public transportation, but we don't really have that. And I think there's a long drive for a lot of people, not just seniors, but a lot of people to get to health appointments. And I think you brought that up in transportation, but we don't have public transportation. And you talked about people driving to work. Well, hopefully people will start working from home and doing a lot of that. But I think there's a lot of concern with emissions and things like that, and how can we make health services more accessible and not so much of a carbon footprint that we're creating with our health services. And I guess that's all I have.
I am struck by the dichotomy from what I see from what was presented in terms of some of the things that were called out as most impressive for our community, as well as things that were danced around, but I think have the potential to be the biggest threats to our community. Our open space was called out. The unique character of our town in terms of a historic district, in terms of our agricultural heritage has been called out, all as positive things. On the other hand, our consultants have danced around the word bedroom community, because no one likes that word, but yeah, that's what we're becoming. We're suburbanificate, I don't know how you want to say it, but we're becoming a suburb of nowhere, I guess, because, but that kind of, and towns, from my understanding, towns that are where we are, rapidly developing, losing their rural character, don't get to develop a new character unless they're real thoughtful about it. And it's real easy for us to become, from what I hear, that with the rate of growth, that we need to be thoughtful about how we move forward so we can keep the town we love I believe people love at least in town, while simultaneously accommodating this growth that is coming whether we like it or not, and possibly fostering the growth in ways that are best for the citizens and residents of this town. I have ideas on that go in the next section.
Matt, can I just ask you a question?
Oh, please.
About that? Has there been discussion in town, say, recently about what that might look like? Either whether it's like areas people feel are appropriate for growth, or where they might want to direct it versus areas where they'd like to preserve either the character or the open space or whatever it might be?
There are people who could probably answer that better than me in this room. My understanding is, yes, those discussions are happening. My opinion as a citizen, I'm also the chair of the planning board, and I'm on the planning board chair as of Monday. But my opinion as a citizen of this town is that those discussions are not happening at a fraction of the rate we need to be making these decisions to save our town.
Do you see a role for this process in addressing those? Is that something that we should, so, you know, we sort of talk about each of these in groups throughout this, but is that something that we should be focusing on as a particular element?
My opinion as a citizen is that I am enthusiastic, so as both a board member and as a citizen, I am enthusiastic about this master planning process, because I think it will help us figure out what we should be doing in aiming. My personal opinion, I have very specific personal opinions about how I think we should get there. But on a broader sense, I think as a board member, it is fantastic that we're going to be doing this, and if we look around this room, there are as many town residents as there are consultants, and if we get rid of the town residents that aren't also government officials, that gets real small real fast. So I look forward to us finding ways to pull in the rest of the community, because I have very strong opinions about what we should be doing. However, I'm certainly not the only person in this community with strong opinions, and I bet some of them are contradictory to mine.
That's very helpful, you know, at this stage of the process. It allows us to think about how we pivot, I think we use that word at some point, to incorporate that. So, that actually brings up a question. Debbie, you mentioned the lack of parking around here. In terms of where we have meetings, I'm assuming that lack of parking is kind of a known factor. Is that something that's likely to discourage people to attend a meeting? Why should I get in my car and go to a meeting when I'm not going to get a parking space? So I'm going to have to, you know, walk half a block to get there, or 2 blocks.
I don't think it's a problem for here for these meetings. I mean, well, we had a meeting for a tax issue where we had to meet at the high school recently, but I don't think we're going to get that kind of turnout. No, I don't think that's what deterred people tonight. But I think for major town events, like even something like when they used to have band concerts down in the Common, parking was an issue.
A nightmare.
Yeah. So town functions, and I think moving forward, if we want to have more town functions, which I think we're going to do, we're coming up on our 300th year. We want to have a year full of celebrations. Parking is going to be a huge issue, because we're going to want to get the townspeople together in one place at one time. Where are we going to put the people? Where are we going to put the cars? How are we going to get people in one place? Right now, there are not a lot of places we can do that.
Does the town have a sort of events planning kind of contingency? Because it is an occurrence that.
So I think pre-COVID, there were numerous, half a dozen or so, mostly annual events that happened, and it was sort of ad hoc. Different groups were involved. Often the Lions Club is heavily involved as a partner because they tend to bring the grill, they have people, they have manpower. The Cultural Council was trying to get the Arts Festival off the ground, which they did successfully for a couple of years, and then time stopped. You know, there have been historic events that were well attended. I mean, COVID really threw all of that into a tizzy. It took away a whole lot of momentum and human capital, and most of the folks who were the sort of gas to that energy have sort of moved on, and so now it's sort of re-coalescing, but it's taking a lot longer than I think anyone anticipated, and it's finding that momentum. It's finding, you know, people have moved on to other things, and the world has changed a little bit. And we're just starting to kind of get back to that 2018, 2019 feeling, and I don't know that there's been a full amount of folks coming forward and being dedicated to it.
So then that brings us to an interesting question for us to hear maybe from you all, is to get people involved in those conversations about what the town should look like, what it should be, what it should feel like to people living here. And if we've got people who aren't coming to these meetings, how best could we reach out to them? What are the best forums or formats or ways of getting people engaged in some of these questions? And are there some questions that are more likely to drive attendance than others?
I think that one very important thing in this community that wasn't mentioned in the presentation, but is here as always, is our public access people. They're wonderful, and they go to everything, including graduation and pouring rain. So I think that they are huge. People watch them. I can't believe the amount of watches I see. I'm chair of the school committee, and I'll look and who are these people that are watching this? You know, so I think that's a huge asset for this community, and a huge way to get people, because what they do is they broadcast on public access, which of course is limited to people who have cable, but they also rebroadcast on YouTube. So anybody can get them, and through Facebook. So it's something that I think many people in town avail themselves of. Not everybody, you know, maybe 20% of people or something like that. I don't know, that's just a number I threw out that people would know better than I do. But I think that's something that is an asset in the community. And as far as big events in town, the biggest one I can think of currently is homecoming. And we do this huge float parade thing, and people come out, and the kids, you know, you throw candy at the kids and all that jazz. Parking isn't an issue for that because it's a parade, you know, so it's all spread out. But that would be another. And the band concerts were moved from the lower common to outside of Passios, primarily because of the danger of the lower common. And during COVID, they wanted to spread people out, and they found it was much less dangerous in front of Passios than at that common with, you know, you have to have eyes in the back of your head to watch young kids not go flying into the street.
On Lancaster.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's more parking.
And there's much more parking in Athens.
Yeah.
Because the library's open for most of the concert. And a playground for the kids that have to run and don't want to listen to music. So that's, you know, something that there is in the community.
When do you do homecoming?
Homecoming's in usually October. It's football related.
I figured it might be that.
The other thing I wanted to comment on was the interesting timing of this project with the municipal building project. because that's a huge thing in a small town, and trying to figure out what to do with all these buildings. And, you know, we have a fair amount of buildings that are just sort of left, and we don't know what to do with, and the group's worked really hard to come up with some ideas, but I think in common with this particular project, I think the timing is, perhaps the municipal building is a little ahead of this timing, but I think it's all good conversation to happen right about this.
Have you, in that process, have you sort of, how to say that, like evaluated whether or not you want to keep, like which buildings you definitely want to keep, which buildings you don't want to keep, and which are sort of, we'll see how much it costs to keep them? Is that something you've done?
That's what they are in the process of doing. I'll throw that question to a member of the committee though, because I'm not on that committee.
Excuse me, yeah, Matt Allison, I'm on the planning board.
All right.
Yeah, that topic actually came up at it might have been our last meeting that we had, is that had the master plan been done on scheduled and not be late as it has been, we may not have needed this municipal building design committee, because I believe that this master plan will touch upon stuff like that, and had we been continually updating it and keeping track of it, following along with it, looking at the goals that we had, and measuring our steps as we progress, I don't think there would have been a need. I don't think there would have been this glut of unused excess buildings, so to speak. So yeah, that had come up at our.
Matt, is there a time frame for the release of the committee's sort of, I guess, plan or recommendation about, I guess, whatever the end product of the committee is going to be?
You're not going to let me here. So this is 11-year circular chasing our tail thin. Yeah, the Municipal Building Design Committee has been 3 or 4 years now, and it's a follow-on for a building design, building reuse committee, which was 7 years. Right? They chase their tail. They go around in circles. Myself included. I'm part of this circus, and you know, we come up with the best, greatest ideas that we can come up with possibly, and then it gets shut down at town meeting because it's too much money. It's not a school. It's in a bad spot. You know, we don't like the color. There's, quite honestly, I don't think there is much community left in Lunenburg. And it pains me to say this. I've recently come to the realization that the town that I grew up in is dead. It's gone. Nothing left of it. Or nothing there except the building, some of the people. Our last election, we had, what, 600 people show up? No? 600 people out of the 12,000 population, and there's well over 8,000 registered voters. 600 people showed up.
I heard that.
It's pathetic, quite honestly.
Is there anything that would get people more engaged? A topic,
Reason they're
Yeah.
maybe something that
Don't go there. Do not go there.
Should we float a rumor?
I've been wondering on this, and a correlation I've seen. Correlation is not causation, but it also isn't definitely not causation. There is no more way to communicate things in society. And I've talked to Adam about this just the other day, actually, where so we have this idea in town government, well, you should come to the meeting. The agenda was posted, so you should have known X was happening. Well, except, okay, it's posted at town hall, in the newspaper, and with no discredit to the Lunenburg Ledger. But on average, people don't read the newspaper anymore. It's a wonderful thing, and they should maybe, but they don't. And for a while, that was kind of even supplanted within modern society by Facebook. But now Facebook is a great way to get people who are at their youngest meet. And even then, due to proprietary algorithms and everything else, you're not guaranteed to reach people. So the idea of we'll reach out via social media is limited by the fact that social media is actually highly fragmented, and the trend seems to be fragmenting it further, and we don't have a way of centralizing communication. But that means it's very hard to get any idea out there. How can you get the idea of a community celebration out into the community if there's literally no way to talk to the community? I think homecoming's a great example of this. One of the few things we have left that's enough of a tradition that is probably a place to reach people. I know some of my own thoughts. Maybe we have an ice cream social after the parade at homecoming, in all seriousness. Because although it's a parade, it's around one block. It just happens a Lunenburg block is a couple miles. But understanding that, no one is at that parade is actually a far walk from anywhere else on the parade. But looking for those things people already come to and capitalize on it. That doesn't change the fact that getting the word out is hard. And I think that is one of the things that contributes to that community damage. Maybe outside the master plan in terms of what we've done, but it affects our ability to get people together to share their thoughts.
So, I mean, I think in some ways the master plan is something you have to do. You're required to do it, right? So how can you do it in a way that is of benefit to you as a community? And if if this is sort of a, I think just if this is something you want to take on, we're excited by that idea, right? Finding the community, right? I think that's an exciting.
I'm all over that.
I mean, that's an exciting, and what you're describing is it's not a Lunenburg specific problem, right? It's everywhere.
Well, I think maybe one of the things I wrote down is trends show aging population, and I think you hit the nail on the head. We discuss this all the time at our Council on Aging meetings. How do we reach out to an aging population that doesn't do Facebook, that doesn't go to the internet? You're exactly right. How do we reach an aging community, which is trends show, right on your slide, trends show we're growing to an aging population. That's what's happening. And so if we're talking about a master plan that says we're trending to an aging population, how do we reach them? How do we talk to them? How do we find out what they want? That's a tough nut to crack. So,
Do you have a sense of the percentage of people in that population that you're reaching now? Obviously, it's not 100%. We already know that. So, is it,
we send a postcard out this month to everybody that we knew of that was over 50 and said, come to our senior center. This is what we offer. We have no idea. We have no idea how many people we reached. That's the best we can do is snail mail at this point and hope for the best. But that's not answering this question. How do we communicate to an aging population if that's the trend? And do we want to do that? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, the aging trends, though, because the aging is going up, but the under 18 is also going up.
Right, so how do you...
That's crazy.
I know.
The school district can reach those people because what we do is we email, we text, we send things home, in flyers. We have all these different things that we can do because we have everybody's information. But I, as somebody well over 50, did not get one of your postcards. So, how do you find those people? Because we find the school kids. They're there. They come to school.
Tell them to talk to their grandparents.
That actually brings back a piece of feedback I have for the graphs you saw on age distribution. I didn't really like, and the reason, I think they told a good story in that, okay, we're breaking out some key age groups, right? Under 15, 18 to 24 or 26. But what's happening is you have one age group that's 18 years in scope. Another age group is like 8 years in scope. I saw another age group that's 20 years in scope. And then we're giving kind of percentages of people in those cohorts. And on one hand, that's really good if we want to look at how many people are at this theoretical life stage. But I don't know that it gives us thank you for pointing it out. I don't know that it gives us as good of an image. I mean, because I'm like, wow, there's a lot more people in that not quite old yet category.
Right.
Except it's 20 years, and 35 to 44 is 10 years.
Right.
And so if I cut that bar in half, all of a sudden it's not as big of a. And so the scientist in me, like, I get both ways of seeing the data and why, but I think I would have liked to have seen the data both ways.
It's an interesting point too, because there's a big difference between 65 plus and 80 plus in terms of needs, and so, and then the same thing at the younger end of the spectrum. So there's a big difference between, you know, sort of elementary age, then high school, then sort of younger college. So that's a good point.
45 to 54 and 55 to 64, you're engaging different.
Yes.
You know, 45 to 54 is often still school parent. 55 to 64 is often, you know, college parent, and you're looking at things differently. Your engagement is different. Your availability is different.
That's fair.
So if we get more granular on that data, it might tell us a little bit more about that story or the stories that we're looking at.
I don't want to, I'm going to propose that we just segue this conversation. Oops, everybody stay exactly where they are, except me. And try to segue this into the second set of questions that we wanted to address with you, and that's, and we're sort of starting to get there, I think, already, is, you know, what are the sort of visions and goals that we ought to be having for this process. We have started the public survey. We met with Dr. Kate Burnham the other day as a part of our the interviews that Eric was doing, and we asked her if it'd be all right to ask the high school students. So we have a lot of responses. They're skewed to a particular demographic, but this is good. I think that that's a good place to start because it's a active audience. But more importantly, I'm quite serious about this. These are the future civic participants of Lunenburg. So let's get them while they're young to be thinking about these issues. So we'll just go through very quickly, and these I think are a useful way to think about this. Don't take these answers as definitive in any way, because I've already told you, it's skewed. But we've sort of have in two forms, and I think we've experienced a bit of this today. Both the written form that we've left in various places in town, and the online that we push through various media, and we'll continue to do that. And any suggestions you have, please let us know, because we do want and think that it's useful to have this feedback. Next, please. So there was a series of questions. I think you've seen these. What do you like about living in Lunenburg? For the time being, of the 90+ responses we've had, it's the small town feel and the safety that sort of stand out, right? Sort of privacy is shortly after that, and the quality of schools is also on the high side. Next, please. What would you like to change about life in Lunenburg? The school system. It's quite, again, we'll take this with, I don't mean to, but some employment opportunities, condition of sidewalks, retail options, High property taxes, these are also sort of things that, at least a fifth of the respondents thought were worth mentioning. What types of land should the town prioritize for future development? Active recreation and restaurants and retail came big. Again, that may very well have to do with this particular demographic, but those are worthy of consideration. And then sort of the kinds of housing, the types of housing that Lunenburg needs more of. And this was a lot more fragmented, which is sort of interesting. Detached single family, small apartments between buildings between 4 and 19 units, mixed use buildings, and assisted living are sort of all relatively equal, which is interesting. What sort of commercial industrial uses, retail, restaurants, outdoor recreation, and healthcare. In terms of transportation, also much kind of fragmented. Everything from walking and bicycling to buses, and then just general kind of road safety and congestion management. In terms of the sort of natural, cultural, and historic resources, the big winner there was protect wildlife habitats, something we're quite keen on as well, but everything else was sort of more or less equal on that list. In terms of recreation, bike trails, ice skating were sort of the biggest ones, but quite a few got around 20%, between 20 and 25%. So I know you've taken the survey, but I think it's worth kind of thinking about those things, and what resonated with you, what was a mischaracterization on my part, what do you think is overemphasized or underemphasized on that list, and of the different categories, and again, we recognize that these categories, they're fluid. There are things that will touch multiple categories. But when you sort of think about this, what would you want us to concentrate on during this process, moving forward? So I'll sort of take a back seat again, and let's just continue the conversation with that kind of extra prompt in mind.
So I think I would emphasize strong caution in reading too much into those numbers, given that they're not weighted equally across age demographics. You could, as you saw, you could just be blowing up proportion of single demographic choice that doesn't represent the entire rest of the town itself. So if we have, 10% of the population pushing up one category, 70% of the actual vote in this instance, there are ways you can mess with the data to account for, we got 70 people that are in the under 18 group and we got 10 people that are in the over 65 group. You can weight them to actually equal them out. So I would like to see what that looks like if we could get that sort of proportionality to it.
And again, we intend to keep this survey open for quite a bit of time, and we want to change the overall spread by the end of it. And if we don't, we'll also find ways to weight it that it is. And we're sort of, please consider this a sort of snapshot in time as a way. I don't think because 90 high school kids said we need more restaurants, that's going to be the focus of the
That would be the one grain of truth.
but although that may be a common desire, but so certainly, this is just the beginning of this effort, and we're showing to you really as a kind of way to talk about the things that this group, which is a different skew, would prioritize.
What I see in there that sort of throws
places. Whalen is a very dense, both residential and commercial area. The village center has a lot of different uses that have a density to it. But when you look at connecting housing to those other dense areas, how does one focus on doing that from a physical infrastructure perspective without having a $40 billion sidewalk project that has, you know, we have, I think it's 87 miles of roads. So are we now talking about 87 miles of sidewalk or 80 miles of sidewalk, because we might have 7 at this point. So while I think there's value in it, and I understand people wanting to be able to have multimodal transportation, we are a complete streets community. I think it's a matter of reframing what that multimodal aspect is. Is it wider shoulders? Is it focusing on having a hard shoulder that provides multi-use and protection for folks doing that? Or is there other new ways that we haven't thought about that maybe aren't as expensive, don't have as much maintenance, and are able to be applied ubiquitously?
Another assumption I heard mentioned, that I think was just an off-the-cuff statement, but is worth really thinking about. We talk about, the high schoolers are the future civic engagement leaders. Oh my God, I almost called us Lemmings. What is wrong with me? Wow. And no offense to the community I used to teach in like over a decade ago, but they're not if we don't fix our housing that's affordable problem. And I mean, we're actually pretty good in terms of affordable housing. Although I would make an argument that there's reasons to be better and proactive so that we could prevent other people telling us how to make affordable housing. Independent of affordable housing, which is a defined thing, there's housing people can afford.
Right.
And we don't have that in Lunenburg. I mean, there's some. But, I mean, I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old. What are the odds that once they're out of college and get their first job, they're going to be able to get an apartment in Lunenburg and then afford a house in Lunenburg on that fresh, let's assume they go to college and that fresh out of college salary. That's dicey. I mean, my wife and I for years lived in Fitchburg. We drove up Northfield Road where I live now because we go to Dick's for vegetables. And we looked at each other and said, man, sure, it's too bad we're never going to make enough money to live here. We lucked out, but a lot of kids growing up in this community aren't, unless we think of ways to solve that problem. And when we think about solving that problem, we can look at the housing people say they want, but I think it's also worth knowing people don't know what they don't know. There's other options out there that people may or may not like, that we could enact as a government, that, and then by government also in the whole town, because we're a New England democracy. Things like building micro communities, maybe you set aside 5 acres of, maybe, 10 acres of land, and we put 10 units on 2 acres, and the other remaining 8 acres are then either set aside for either agricultural use or for conservation use. That isn't in the public perception. Yet it's a way we could actually be building housing that is more affordable because developers don't have to build the same infrastructure, as well as meet some of our other goals for preserving rural character or conservation land. But things like that just aren't even in the public radar. And there's things that each of us have heard of or thought about that no one else has. And it's never going to show up in a public survey. And not only is getting that idea existing a challenge, but then educating the public about these things exist and why it's good so we can solicit their feedback.
To circle back a little bit to what Adam was talking about, I wonder if part of the sidewalk discussion, or sidewalk selection was a response to the highways that exist between 2A, 13, Leominster Ave, and Lancaster Ave. It's just, you're getting people that are saying, I watch people drive down my road going 60 miles an hour, and it's, you know, a lane and a half wide. But there's no way to put a sidewalk there. But I would love one. So I wonder how many people are sort of just, it's sort of wishful thinking, and that there is no way to actually to do something like that.
Do you think one way to get at it, sort of going back to what you were saying in the discussion around earlier about where to potentially accommodate growth that's desirable versus preservation, would one way to address the infrastructure be to focus the infrastructure on smaller chunks in specific places? Like, we know town center is a place where people come and they want to be able to walk, drive, maybe potentially like just in and around the area, so let's build that out. Then in Wayland, we know there's places where people want to go, or another commercial corridor somewhere else that maybe in the future looks a little different than it does today. And almost like build out small places and then figure out like the thread that, I guess, the more feasible way to like thread those things together without having to build a, $50 million multi-use, pathway off the side of a 8-mile road.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably part of it. I think if you look at the way commercial development is going mixed use, it's going, pockets that have multimodal, accessible, housing, retail, maybe sometimes office, but then you go there and you park in one place and you're able to access everything. I think that it is one way to address it. I mean, that makes sense to me from a personal, professional perspective. I don't know if that's what people would look for, but I think it's one way to address some of those needs.
The bit that I'm coming up to, so we talk about both the town's kind of like rural and agricultural feel, and like what is the economic development like for the town? What is it that we can do to like encourage that economic development? Like, is town focused, not outside business? How do we make it so that it is more appealing to agricultural use, that it's more appealing to like services that are built in the town and designed to service people in the town. Whatever that may be, minor construction or HVAC systems or, kind of anything that you need. How do we have like small scale community focused businesses or agricultural, how do we push things in those directions so that when we're looking 10 years down the road, the kind of feel of the town is one, or the historic feel of the town is what we're kind of pushing back towards or growing towards.
Do you know if there are pockets, so Mary mentioned the West earlier, are there pockets of other home-based businesses that can be done? One of the things that we often look for is there a need, somebody's been doing catering at a kitchen, for example, and they could grow, they need that next step to commercial kitchen. This is an easy example. Are there things that you're seeing out there where people have that next step space that can really grow something well and do it, whether it's press business or office business, maker space, something like that, if there's anything missing there.
Members of our economic development committee have lamented what they perceive as some of the challenges of making that step from a home-based business to a small separate business space, 1,500 square feet or whatever. Now, in practice, I don't know that our hurdles are different than anywhere else in the region. However, people feel this way with others. And so that has been done.
And on that same sort of subject, do you have any, even anecdotal stories that people know, somebody who started their business here and then went beyond Nuremberg's borders to somewhere else because they couldn't get space there?
I think, did Trudy's Treats start here? And I know that there was a baking company. Matt, you probably have the best. The 3 Lancaster across the way here used to be Trudy's Treats, and it was a cafe where they were making these goods, and they grew to the point where they were starting to supply grocery stores, and they were unable to expand there in order to create a commissary, and so they went to an adjoining community, if I'm not mistaken.
I think they started in the adjoining community.
It came here.
And then came here
Okay.
to open the cafe piece.
Hmm. Well, and I know that
But either way.
we do have a very successful coffee business that started as a home roaster.
Yeah.
They expanded, and they have a cafe here in town where they also roast. And now they're looking to expand to additional spaces. So they're looking to retain the space that they have and grow. So we do have a history of people taking a home business and growing it. But we have an immense amount of home businesses. Many, I think, are professionals. I think if we went and looked at the business certificates, lawyers, accountants, various massage therapists, stuff like that, that can happily do their business at home and don't necessarily need that expansion. But I think there's also plenty of folks who do maybe woodworking or other trade, craft, skilled artisan type stuff that theoretically could expand.
Or there might be a market for business services, like somebody who provided a conference room, so those lawyers, accountants, whatever, could once a month meet with clients that,
Sure.
outside of the client's business.
There are that kind of services, at least there were, I haven't looked recently. I know there were those kinds of services, conference rooms and whatnot, offered in Fitchburg. And I only bring that up because I don't know if that one's still in business or what the market saturation is in terms of supply and demand.
One of the things that I've enjoyed about the community in Lunenburg, that like currently they only exist as like Facebook things, is we've got like the Lunenburg Buy Nothing, like Town Share, these kind of things where like we can coordinate, communicate like across the town to be like, oh, what do you need? I've got this. Does anybody want it? I'm looking for this. As more of like a town tool share or skills trade or any of those kinds of things where it's between people in the community, like what do you have, what skills do you have, what tools do you have, like what can we do to support each other with the things that we already have.
I've seen those where you put in like 5 hours of work and get 5 credits
Yeah.
that you can then transfer, if they formalize it, yeah.
Another thing I was thinking in terms of community and organization is like we've got town events that people want to go to. We've got homecoming. I think somebody's trying to resurrect the town bonfire. Like, how do we connect those community things to start coordinating between people and transfer that to like town volunteering boards? The kind of organization things that we're trying to do for the rest of the town that aren't just necessarily events.
So you get the people together and then it's, hey, so-and-so broke their leg, they need somebody to go and run errands for them. And there's a community board of volunteers
Yeah.
that's pulled out of that or we're gonna do a cleanup day for, you know, park down the street and get volunteers. So there's that way of organizing the community into those kind of non-official events.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's an interesting question.
This is looking back to the previous section, but I think it should be voiced explicitly, especially where I bring up the suburbification of Lunenburg. Matt talks about, understandably, is it even the same town anymore than it used to be? And I certainly can't speak to that aspect of it, but I think a strength that really can't be overstated, because it's so key. You need to look at someone's face when they tell you they're moving to Lunenburg, that they bought their house in Lunenburg. You need to look on Facebook when someone says, oh, I was thinking about moving to town. Is this a good town to move into? And cut out the people who are just bitter for the sake of being bitter. And I don't mean constructive criticism in that. And you need to look at the positivity that is felt about this community. And that goes all the way from government officials, Selectman Mr. Jeffries giving a very impassioned speech, I believe it was at a town meeting, about fully planning to die in this town someday because he loves it so much. Look at my new neighbors who have moved in, who were looking to move to Lunenburg for a long time, or my wife and I, who were previously in the same boat. People want to be here, and it isn't just because of what's on paper. It isn't just, well, there's good schools, and it's close to the highway, or this or that. They want Lunenburg. So there's a value in what we are. And it still exists, and I don't think we want to lose sight of that in this discussion, that people, while we try to get them to care in a way that helps here, they care. It's just that step.
So it's how to connect that desire for, it's, as you said, it's not, oh, it's close to the highway, it's beautifully rural, blah, blah, blah. There is this sense that Lunenburg is a special place. How to translate that positivity into the connections that we've been sort of trying to get at here.
While also at the same time not pushing out the fringes, your fixed salaries, your over 60, over whatever ages to their fixed salaries, or your I have friends that are minorities that have been pushed out because they can't afford it, or they're not for whatever reason. It's while I agree there is this idea that is Lunenburg, I think it still needs to modernize itself to an extent, and accept the fact that, well, the diversity that's in the town is not represented in this room. Is that because we don't have the space for them? Is that because, why is that? Which then brings up one of the future big elephants, which is going to be 40B. Because we don't have that. We're not currently meeting the requirement by the state. And as we're increasing our population, it's just going to get worse. So there will need to be space that's absolutely set up for and planned out for how we can accommodate that.
And if we plan that out, we can do it in a way that benefits everyone and makes everyone feel good about it, rather than people coming and informing us what's happening and using the very large cudgel of state law.
Yeah.
The idea of being proactive rather than reactive.
That's a skill I think that we have yet to acquire.
Yeah.
Lunenburg is not,
It's also important to recognize that 40B and affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean inclusivity.
True.
It's completely numbers based, and I think that what you're alluding to, and I think what Matt was alluding to,
is taking the community that we have and trying to expand the inclusivity of it to welcome and bring people in. And I think that that's something that the town has done, but I think there's always more work to be done.
I think if we're going based off the survey, and that I thought I saw, I don't think 40B is necessarily the way to kind of expand the diversity of the community or make it more accessible. 40B is a loophole that a large contractor is going to use to come in and say, we're 40B housing, we have 3 units that are affordable. And that doesn't accomplish what we're looking for. The survey where we're talking about community housing, co-ops, stuff like that, that will accomplish that, because if we want to bring in diversity, we also need to recognize that people from outside of our community, outside of this country even, are used to living and relying on one another, having a community where they know that they are surrounded by people that they can go to for any multitude of things, childcare, whatever. And that's not going to come from some giant developer in Boston coming to town and knocking down a bunch of trees and building disgusting housing that are just going to price gouge. It's not how that works.
Will those houses, though, count towards the required percentage of affordable homes in the town? I don't know.
There are
Who builds them and what their prices are. Are they going to be co-owned by a cooperative of people or a group of people? I mean, you can use buzzwords like affordable housing and they mean nothing if it's not actually attainable for people. Like the threshold for affordable housing is still not attainable.
But I think what Evan's getting to is we have a legal mandate to meet, and those types of housing, and I think the answer to your question is maybe, because it's all in how they're crafted, how the ownership is, what the deed restrictions and legal requirements are, and how they play with the comprehensive permit regulations and requirements. So you don't have to have a comprehensive permit to create affordable housing. There's just a lot more tracking and paperwork that goes along with ensuring that housing created outside of that has that long-term protection, hopefully in perpetuity, that meets those specific numeric thresholds.
And there are communities that do mandate that kind of housing built into developments that are built. I have friends who actually, over a decade ago now, founded a co-housing development in Berlin, and part of that was with the town mandate that X% be considered affordable housing within the legal sense. And so it is doable. It is doable for the town to mandate it to push things forward.
There's co-housing like that in Cambridge as well, that's been mandated in perpetuity.
I don't know if it falls under their umbrella, but people like Habitat for Humanity and stuff do also, like, we can look at their model and how they go about building affordable housing for people to own a home and to like have a piece of land and something that they can call their own, but they also like, I did work with them when I was a teenager and I was part of helping them build a whole community in a cul-de-sac in West Virginia somewhere. And they already had a whole slew of people who would not have been able to own a home otherwise, ready to move into this beautiful little community. And last I heard that they were thriving and it was still considered part of that town's, certainly the West Virginia, part of their threshold for affordable housing.
I recognize that we promised you a 2-hour meeting, but we're happy to keep talking. I'm really curious, and like maybe end with a plea for suggestions from any and all of you as to how we can help in this process to reach as many people in town as possible. Because I really do think if we can do one thing, it's that. So I really like the idea, for example, of not hijacking, but piggybacking on things like homecoming, for example, showing up, making an event around an event like that. I think actually mailers may be at least you know that you're into people's mailboxes, as opposed to the ether. I'm interested in hearing any, between this hour and this hour, there's a coffee clutch over here or whatnot. Opportunities that we could have to start a conversation.
Have you thought about, or is there ways to speak to the youth in our community? Speaking with, even like ages 10 and up, going to the schools, because they come home and they tell everything that they're doing as well.
So hopefully they told them that they had to fill out a survey last week. I'm hoping that's a start, because they did. We did communicate through the administration. High schoolers were asked to fill out that survey. So at the moment, we have a lot of answers that skew to sort of 14, 18 age group.
I don't have any high schoolers, but I remember well, I wasn't talking to my friends too much about.
See, my high school didn't tell me.
Well, kind of around that, where they might still have a vested interest in maintaining this community long after, their parents are old or gone, and they also still talk to their parents. Sometimes it depends.
We can always ask the superintendent to send something.
Yeah.
Like the information that I got from Adam, she could send your survey home to everybody. I mean, she'd only get school people, obviously. You're not going to get senior citizens, but that people that open their email would see it.
We also have a farmer's market, so we can set up like a
Oh,
farmer's
that's a
market.
good suggestion.
Fundraisers on the Ritter Lawn for Scouts tend to do well, and I see other organizations working the town center as well for fundraisers, because there's a lot of traffic in town passes through the town center, and people are kind of held up by the stoplight and they see what's going on. But just being aware again, you're getting a specific subsection of the town. You're not necessarily getting the same representation from Whalum, from that little bit of Lunenburg that overtouches Fitchburg over by Summer Street? I can't remember. Yeah. So we're not necessarily getting all of town that way, but things in that area like the farmer's market, like others, do get traction. I wonder if we can also, thinking out loud, I don't know that there's enough people who want to volunteer, but I wonder if there's a way for us to get volunteers to help get the word out. And even because 3 hours on one weekend day gets you some, but not that many. Is there a way to get people who are interested in getting this to happen to work longer, work other areas to get more feedback and more engagement?
Over by the Wayland area, wasn't there something that you worked and more recently down to do with the mechanic there that's in front of that street on Electric Ave?
Sure.
Maybe we could make it part of the deal where they use their rapidly big inflatable arm guy. He's holding up a sign. Also the flyers in the food pantry boxes.
Oh, that's
The
a good
food
idea.
pantry. Because everybody from all over town comes to that.
What kind of other micro communities do we have? The tax abatement thing kind of really solidified that the lake community, that they all definitely communicate and coordinate. But what other small micro communities do you have that can be branching points for this further reach?
Has anybody engaged in that? Annette, Ms. Queen, the TLC. I feel like she's everywhere. And she talks to everyone and she knows everyone. She's definitely also a community of, I think, with.
I mean, there's the youth sports organizations. They have a pretty wide reach.
Knowing what we've just heard, so I'm used to the idea that no one watches town meeting meetings because sitting on the planning board, we're not exciting. I find us exciting. And I think there's like 4 of us in town who find it exciting we're on the board. So, but knowing that other boards are getting a lot of viewership, thank you for saying that. Can we get other boards in town plugging it? Not once, but every dang time. Because although this is overseen by the planning board, this is an everybody project. And the school committee should, and I hope does, see their vested interest in the master planning. Even the water and sewer commissions, just all of it hits on everybody. So wouldn't it be great if other groups were opening their meetings, not closing their meetings, but opening their meetings by saying, hey, this is happening, do X, every single time for months. Like, just so we're hitting people in the head with it, because people don't watch every meeting. They watch it when they care about the topic. And so you can't just do it a few. But if we can get the other town boards doing it, if people are watching, that may be the way to go.
And put the link to the survey in the description on the YouTube video. So that's right there, they just click it. Yes. Yep.
I'll start putting a QR code on my agendas.
Thank you. Well, QR codes are bad ideas. Just having, I shared the picture on Facebook, and the response I immediately got was, "Where's the link?" There's no link.
How do I take a picture of a QR code with my phone that I'm currently looking at the QR code?
Yeah. Just it's not. People don't, and even if they do, not everyone knows. And even like fairly younger tech savvy people, if they're not interacting in that specific way with it, and like Google changed over the past several months how I got it on Android for QR codes, so I had to relearn it. So I think the easy to type in links, maybe I could see an easy justification that it's worth the $15 for a domain to redirect. LunenburgTownSurvey.org, and because anyone can type that in and tell it by word of mouth, might be a way to share it easier.
You can get it on pack on channel 89099 on those cards that flip up, but it's got to be easy. You can't do something that they have to type.
The QR code is.
The QR code works on TV.
Does it? You can hold
Yeah.
your phone up to
Well,
the
yeah,
picture. You just can't do it if it's on your phone.
Right.
The person has to know what on earth they're.
They have,
Exactly.
depends on their level, yeah.
That can come
I
with
think
it.
you want something that, with the short and sweet.
Like, I really think a domain redirect from, I mean, I would pay the $20 for that myself, just because
I think that's where you want to go.
like, and not using the new top level domains that are very cool, but people don't recognize, and I'm finding software. When I did qr.link, no software parsed that as a link that should be highlighted, even with the proper HTTP in front. So I think, like I said, a LunenburgTownSurvey.org or Lunenburg Master Plan,
Yes.
something that they can remember and spell easily, .org, .net, .com, so they
I mean,
remember.
if you did master plan, you could also then make that kind of your page where it updates on what's going on with it and the questions that we have, when the next meeting will be, stuff like that. Because there's still going to be people who aren't going to be able to make it to any meetings, but should and want to have input.
Yeah. But it can redirect to something even more. I'm thinking town-wise, my understanding is getting a web page up is not a quick process. But even having a domain that redirects just to the survey for now, and then we can build it out later if we wish, might be a way to do that.
I have an unorthodox suggestion. How many places in town sell tall garbage bags? Like 5?
Mhm.
We can get volunteers to take the survey to the bags of the garbage bags that everybody buys. Everybody buys garbage bags.
They all have to get it done.
I'd say that is one of the more creative
I- Or
I had one community put in the pizza box.
Yeah, it's a finite amount of places that sell the garbage bags.
taping the whole survey might be cost prohibitive.
Or even
But-
a code or
But
something.
that's me, a paper
that says do
with
this.
a URL that can be typed.
You can still do it with a QR, it's just QR code scanned with your phone
Yeah.
camera, like it just needs a
Everybody
little bit
buys
of
garbage
instruction.
bags.
But not
I
everyone
really,
says
I
the
really
QR
think
code.
we're overestimating. Those of us who have used QR codes, it's very easy for us to overestimate how much other people
Struggle.
do not understand that.
Sure, it's also easy to underestimate how much people hate typing. And trying to like.
I mean, in fairness, you can put both.
Jerry.
What Jerry's suggesting, you could easily
do both.
Yeah.
No, it's
It
a
could be
fair.
a QR code and then a hyperlink beneath it, and
Get
that's you're
people
done.
to tape them to the bags, or get the vendor the bag and put them in the bag.
That's hard. That's easier said than done.
Right, with the vendor, absolutely. But we could probably get high schoolers to.
A sign right next to where people buy the bags. Yeah.
They
National
hide
Honor
them.
Society.
They hide the
You have
bags.
to buy them at the register.
Yeah, they have them hidden
Couldn't
because they get
invite
stolen.
schools to Hannaford's and Mackey and ask them for their garbage bags for community service and rubber band a piece of paper to it and give it back to Hannaford's?
I mean, could we, but I say that, but could we coordinate what, does the National Honors, does
I was
Lunenburg
gonna
have a
say,
National Honor Society?
Absolutely,
And-
and they need to do community service.
That,
We also have
The Scouts,
at-risk
too.
programs
Yeah.
that
Plenty
they might
of
be able to
community
do
service.
that. The
That-
Scouts could do it, there are youth groups that could do it.
and their wrists still work because they haven't ruined it for years of typing, so even better.
That is possible.
Can we make use of the toll booth system as well in the center of town?
And just hand it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you get a lot of cross traffic. So with the amount of surveys that you'd hand out, the percentage of Lunenburg residents might be, you know, I mean that's a state road. It's a major east-west travel. I think you would have diminishing returns on the cost of the survey printing and the amount of effort you put into getting people to stop and roll their window down so you could shove it in there for them. And you might collect a couple $100, but
Pay for the printing.
Pay for that reader. Any final thoughts? This has been for us, I feel very instructive and really just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're grateful for your time.
I know we're paying you for this, but we're still grateful for your time and your enthusiasm, to be very clear.
We're excited. And again, I know there are competing things to do on a Thursday night. Thank you for spending it with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I would have been here earlier, but my daughter was 7.
I brought my 9-year-old.
When's our next meeting?
Thank you all very much.
When it says phase 2?
no,
We have another one in
we'll
August
have
of
a steering
2024.
committee meeting probably later this summer. I only have 6 members right now. The planning board has 6 members to appoint. The select board keeps pushing us on.
Yeah.